The year was 1944. Across the ruins of Europe, the German war machine still moved with a terrifying kind of discipline. But deep inside its steel heart, something had begun to crack. The endless thunder of artillery, the distant rumble of American convoys, and the choking gray smoke of ruined cities told the same story. Time was no longer on Germany's side. Inside a captured field office near Aachen, a group of German analysts huddled over a long wooden table covered in crumpled maps and seized Allied paperwork. Among them were officers from the Wehrmacht's Logistics Corps, intelligence specialists from the Abwehr, and economists who had been pressed into uniform. What they were studying was not a secret weapon, nor a battle plan, but something far more mundane: U.S. Army Quartermaster supply charts. At first glance, the charts looked harmless, columns of numbers, shipment schedules, fuel tonnages, production statistics. Yet within those lines of ink lay the mathematical proof of Germany's doom. The papers had been captured when an American transport truck was ambushed near the Siegfried Line. Inside, its cargo sat crates of rations, uniforms, and one folder stamped Confidential War Department Supply Division. When it arrived in the hands of German High Command, it was treated as a minor intelligence find. But the analysts soon realized what they were looking at was no ordinary logistical list. It was a complete snapshot of the U.S. Army supply operations for the European theater. The data was overwhelming. Page after page described tonnage moved from American ports to England, quantities of ammunition distributed weekly, spare parts shipments for tanks and aircraft, fuel consumption projections, and replacement rates for every type of vehicle from Jeeps to B-24 bombers. Captain Dieter Weiss, a meticulous statistician from Hamburg, adjusted his glasses and frowned. "These figures cannot be correct," he said quietly. "If they are, then the Americans can replace everything we destroy, almost instantly." The others laughed nervously at first, but as they checked the arithmetic, their smiles faded. The U.S. was producing supplies on a scale that defied logic. For every tank Germany built, the Americans built 10. For every aircraft lost in combat, 2 more were already en route to the front. And most shocking of all were the fuel statistics. Entire rivers of gasoline, diesel, and aviation fuel flowing across the Atlantic on a conveyor belt of Liberty ships that never seemed to stop. One chart showed that by mid-1944, the United States was shipping 1.5 million tons of supplies per month to Europe. Weiss stared at the number for a long time. He knew that Germany's entire monthly output of critical materials, steel, oil, and munitions barely reached a fraction of that. He whispered, "If this is true, then the war is already lost." Outside, artillery rumbled. The analysts worked through the night, translating and comparing figures. They realized that the Allied strategy wasn't just brute force, it was precision. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of fuel had a destination, and the system worked with machine-like regularity. Germany had built its early victories on lightning attacks, on speed, surprise, and daring. But wars of endurance were won by logistics, not heroics. And in that domain, the Allies had achieved something Germany never could: industrial infinity. Weiss compiled a report for Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. He titled it Assessment of Anglo-American Supply Potential. His conclusion was short but devastating. The enemy's capacity for replacement and reinforcement is mathematically inexhaustible relative to ours. Even total destruction of one front would not alter the outcome. Time is the decisive weapon now, and it is theirs. When the report reached Berlin, it was quietly shelved. The High Command could not afford despair. Goebbels's propaganda machine continued to promise miracle weapons: the jet fighter, the V-2 rocket, the new U-boat. But inside the intelligence offices, the analysts knew numbers do not lie. In another corner of the Reich, an aging general named Erhard Pohl, head of economic planning for the Waffen-SS, read the captured charts himself. He had once believed that Germany's industrial genius could out-engineer any enemy, but the American system stunned him. Where Germany relied on craftsmanship, the U.S. relied on scale. American factories didn't just build tanks. They built systems that built tanks. Production lines so vast that one shutdown meant nothing. Where a German Panther tank required weeks of precision machining, an American Sherman could be stamped out by the hundreds in a single assembly complex. And unlike Germany, the United States had no shortage of fuel. No bombers overhead, no desperate scavenging for parts. Their homeland was untouched, their factories humming 24 hours a day under bright electric lights, powered by resources so vast that even the war couldn't deplete them. Pohl compared the captured figures with his own data. Germany's total monthly steel output was around 2 million tons. The United States was producing more than 8 million. Aviation gasoline? Germany managed less than 150,000 tons per month. The U.S. produced over $700,000 for Pohl. The realization came not as a shout but as a slow, suffocating silence. All the courage of German soldiers, all the ingenuity of their scientists, all the propaganda of invincibility. None of it could defeat arithmetic. In a dim office, under the faint light of a flickering lamp, he wrote in his diary, "We have outfought them tactically, but they have outbuilt the world." As Allied forces poured through France after D-Day, the consequences of those charts unfolded in real time. U.S. convoys stretched from Normandy beaches to the Rhine, miles of trucks and trailers known collectively as the Red Ball Express. They carried everything: food, ammunition, spare parts, even typewriters, and they never stopped moving. German intelligence tried to sabotage the routes, bombing bridges, mining roads, ambushing convoys, but for every supply line cut, 2 new ones appeared. The Americans didn't just have more equipment, they had more of everything. More men, more fuel, more replacements, more food. Even as Germany rationed bread and recycled scrap metal, American soldiers were receiving hot coffee, chocolate bars, and fresh uniforms. It wasn't arrogance, it was logistics. At the same time, the Luftwaffe's analysts studied captured U.S. aircraft manuals. They discovered something horrifying. American pilots were rotating through training schools at a rate Germany couldn't dream of. While German pilots fought until they died, American airmen rotated home after set missions, replaced by endless waves of trained flyers. War was supposed to be about courage, but now it had become about replacement. By late autumn 1944, Weiss and his team received another batch of captured material, Allied economic forecasts prepared for 1945. The numbers were even more staggering. Weiss simply pushed the paper aside and stared at the wall. His superior asked, "What does it mean?" He replied, "It means that even if we destroy them for a year, they will return twice as strong." Silence fell. Outside, snow began to fall over Germany, a silent gray snow that blanketed burned towns and frozen rivers. The analysts understood what it symbolized: the cold inevitability of defeat. Still, they worked. They kept calculating, reporting, adjusting numbers as if hope could be found somewhere between the margins. But deep down, they all knew. Germany had run out of time, out of oil, out of steel, and soon out of men. The captured American supply charts had revealed a truth that no propaganda could erase. War, in the modern age, belonged to those who could feed it endlessly. And the United States, across the ocean, was feeding it like a machine that never slept. The snow that settled over the Ruhr in late 1944 did not fall softly. It came like a slow burial, each flake a quiet whisper of the world closing in on Germany. Inside the concrete halls of the Oberkommando, men still drew up plans as if victory were a matter of geometry. Lines on maps, arrows, estimates of divisions. But in the dim offices of logistics, where pencils scratched and abacuses clicked, the truth was no longer hidden. The numbers could not lie. Captain Dieter Weiss and his team continued their grim arithmetic. They were no longer searching for strategies. They were performing an autopsy. Every captured report, every intercepted communique, every aerial photograph that hinted at Allied logistics only deepened their despair. In December, a new set of captured documents arrived: American fuel distribution schedules from the Normandy pipeline project. The charts showed a sprawling system of underground fuel lines stretching from the French coast all the way to the advancing front lines. To German eyes, it was something close to sorcery. Operation Pluto, the file read. Pipeline. Under the ocean. Weiss ran his finger along the figures. Hundreds of miles of flexible steel pipe laid beneath the English Channel, pumping aviation fuel directly from Britain to France. That meant Allied aircraft could keep flying endlessly without relying on vulnerable tankers or overland convoys. The logistics team stared in silence. The Americans had literally built an underwater artery to feed their war. Colonel Hartmann, Weiss's superior, exhaled slowly. "They're not fighting a war," he said. "They're running a factory. Europe is their assembly line," Weiss nodded. "And we are the raw material being consumed." He wasn't exaggerating. Every calculation showed the same conclusion. The German army, once the most formidable in the world, was bleeding out not from battle losses, but from exhaustion. The factories could no longer meet demand. Steel shipments from the Ruhr had fallen by 40%. Coal was dwindling. Fuel reserves were measured in days, not months. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, was a shadow of its former self. Allied bombers had shattered its production lines, and even new Me-262 jets couldn't change the tide. Every time Germany introduced a technological marvel, it was smothered under the sheer volume of Allied output. But what haunted the analysts most was not the difference in firepower. It was the efficiency. The American system wasn't improvisation. It was mathematics. Everything. Munitions, medical supplies, rations, vehicle maintenance was planned months in advance, coordinated by thousands of unseen workers across an ocean. Weiss examined the production forecasts. He could trace the rhythm of American industry like a heartbeat. Steel plants in Pittsburgh fed tank factories in Detroit. Rubber from the Pacific flowed to tire plants in Akron. Food from Kansas, ammunition from Illinois, engines from Ohio, each one moving in perfect synchronization. He thought of Germany's own industrial landscape, factories reduced to rubble, railways twisted into molten wreckage, cities burning night after night under Allied bombing raids. Even as the German propaganda ministry promised Wunderwaffen, miracle weapons, the real miracle was already across the ocean, a nation that could build forever. Weeks later, a special intelligence briefing was held in Berlin for senior officers. Weiss was summoned to present his findings. The room was cold, its windows sealed with blackout curtains, a single bulb flickering above the table. He began with a map of Europe. "Gentlemen," he said, voice steady but low, "what you see here are not battle lines. They are supply lines. These determine victory." He pointed to the red arrows representing Allied logistics. "From these routes, the Americans are pushing materials faster than we can destroy them. Their supply throughput is now mathematically unstoppable." A general interrupted, frowning. "Captain Weiss, are you suggesting surrender?" Weiss shook his head. "No, General. I am suggesting we recognize reality. This war is no longer decided by courage or tactics. It is decided by production." The general leaned back, jaw tight. "Germany has survived worse." Weiss hesitated. Then quietly he replied, "No, sir. We have never faced a machine like this." His words hung in the air like smoke. When the meeting ended, no one spoke. The officers filed out in silence, boots echoing down the stone corridor. Later that night, Weiss wrote in his private notes, "Their strength is not only material, it is structural. They fight like an economy, not an army." He wasn't alone in that conclusion. Across Germany, similar realizations were emerging. In the shattered remnants of the Luftwaffe's statistical division, analysts compared losses against Allied replacement rates. They concluded that even if every German fighter pilot shot down 5 bombers a day, the overall Allied air fleet would still grow larger by the end of the month. In Hamburg, industrial engineers calculated that each day of Allied bombing erased 1 week of production. Meanwhile, American factories could rebuild an entire factory's worth of output overnight. One engineer put it bluntly, "We are trying to fight a storm with a candle." By February 1945, the numbers became meaningless. Ammunition shortages crippled entire divisions. Fuel rations dropped to less than 10 liters per vehicle per day. Even the mighty Tiger tanks, symbols of German power, were being abandoned for lack of gasoline. But the Americans never slowed. Captured records showed their convoys arriving at French ports every single day. An endless stream of Liberty ships unloading crates. Barrels, vehicles, even pre-assembled bridges. Each ship was a floating warehouse. And together they formed an industrial tide that no army could resist. Weiss and his colleagues began tracking something they called the replacement curve. It measured how quickly each side could recover from losses. For Germany, the curve was steep and fatal. A destroyed tank meant weeks of lost capacity. For America, it was almost flat. Losses were absorbed instantly. It was as if the U.S. military existed in a different dimension of time. Weiss realized what the numbers meant. America had turned its economy into a perpetual motion engine. feeding itself with infinite loops of supply and demand. Their logistics weren't just efficient, they were self-sustaining. To the analysts, the revelation was both scientific and spiritual. They had spent years believing in willpower, in destiny, in national strength, but here was proof that wars of the modern age were won not by belief, but by systems, by the invisible math of industry, transportation, and coordination. It was the moment they stopped believing in miracles. In March 1945, when Allied tanks crossed the Rhine, Weiss wasn't surprised. He looked at his charts and whispered, "It was inevitable." Outside, Berlin was already trembling under the distant roar of approaching armies. Inside the command rooms, the last remnants of the German war machine continued to churn, issuing orders that no longer mattered. For the analysts, the war had become an equation already solved.